All right, just a couple of things. One is, recall the review session is going to be on the 16th, which is so it's that Tuesday. And I've got the 105 class and yours. So one I'm going to do from 6 to 7:30, and the other I'm doing from 7:30 to 9. And I'm going to let you guys vote. How many would like to do 6 to 7:30? Six. How many would like to do 7:30 to 9? Oh, wow. So let's do it one more time. How many would like to do the 6 to 7:30? And it may not go the whole hour and a half. Okay, so we'll do 6 to 7:30. All right, so that's the, can I borrow your pen for a second? I forgot to bring a pen here. All right, and I forgot to tell you folks that the classic album of the week on Friday, it is Quicksilver Messenger Service. This is their, how many have ever heard of Quicksilver Messenger Service? None of you. Okay. One of the best guitar players of all time. You can even ask Professor Pengrasic. And while you're doing that, does anybody remember the band pick of the week last week? Yeah, and did anybody listen? Not too many? Okay. Well, definitely get on the YouTube. The lead guitarist in that band is Professor Pengrasic. Okay, so he's been asking me, did they really like the album or the song? So listen to it so I can tell them, yeah, this is going well. Anyway, this is their Happy Trails album. It's an interesting album because it's got a 25-minute version of a song, Who Do You Love? Bo Diddley song. And then there's, on the opposite side, there's a 6.5, almost a 7-minute version of Mona, which is another Bo Diddley song. So anyway, if you just get on and listen to Mona, get on Spotify and go to Quicksilver Messenger Service. The other thing is, I guess that's it for you guys. Okay, so 6 to 7:30, and I've reserved this room for the review session. So yeah. Oh yes, the band of the week. Good one. Is Lake Street Dive. Okay, band pick of the week is Lake Street Dive. How many have heard of them? No. Okay. Okay, so you should try them out. They're sort of an indie rock, rhythm and blues. They have a female lead singer. They started in Massachusetts, but I think they might be down in Nashville now. I forget where they're located now. But anyway, you might just take a listen to, try them out. All right, and then, yeah, so I think that's it. All right, so band pick of the week, Lake Street Dive. Okay, so last time we were looking at the chapter 10, the introduction to government finance, and we were just making some comments, some observations. And we talked about that taxes affect market outcomes. We talked about, and generally they'll distort economic activity, other than when we talked about a Pigouvian tax, where you can actually offset an externality if you were to set the tax correctly. We talked about that. They affect the distribution of income. That is, there's a wealth tax that's being proposed in the state of Washington in order to affect the distribution of income and make sure that the super wealthy don't have as much money, and et cetera. So if you listen to that discussion. We talked about the fact that incidence is important, who actually ends up paying the tax. We mentioned the tax on luxury boats ended up causing all sorts of damage to the luxury boat industry. And who ended up bearing the burden of that tax were the people that were being employed there. We talked about that it affects political outcomes, in that how much are people willing to vote for government goods or government services. For example, right now the $1.9 trillion bill that is being discussed in the Congress, as President Biden has been talking about, and of course, whether you would vote for the expenditures would also depend on whether you had to pay taxes for the expenditures. And we'll talk more about when we talk about debt finance, but it doesn't look like the president is suggesting an increase in taxes. You haven't heard any of that, right? Maybe an increase in the corporate income tax is part of that. But primarily, we're talking about spending, and we talked about Vixel, saying, hey, maybe we ought to give you the tax and the expenditures at the same time, and then you can, and that would affect how much people would vote for different taxes. We also talked about that taxes reduce the demand for private goods, right? If I'm taking income away from you, if you have less disposable income, you'll buy more inferior goods, you'll buy less normal goods. And then we noted that specific taxes, like a tax on gasoline, will affect relative prices. Then we talked about the fact that government spending itself affects resource allocation. That is, if I'm buying teacher salary, if I'm hiring teachers, I'm going to have more resources going into education and less resources going into other things that teachers might have been doing in their alternative. And then last, we talked about some definitions, and we said that if you look at what is the tax base, right? So tax base of any particular tax, we said is equal to whatever the item or activity that's being taxed. All right. So the tax base, we say the tax base of an income tax is income. The tax base of a wealth tax is going to be wealth. The tax base of a sales tax is whatever the retail sales are. And so, as I mentioned in the state of Michigan, if you, for example, there's a sales tax on food prepared for immediate consumption, that is when you go to Taco Bell, that is being taxed. But if you buy food at the Kroger's, then that's not taxed. So whatever the items that are being taxed is your tax base. We said that the average tax rate, right? The average tax rate, what is that? That is the average tax rate is going to be your total taxes divided by the value of the base. So if we're talking about income, what's the average tax rate for income? Well, it's whatever the total taxes that are collected under the income tax divided by whatever the total income is. So at least the total income that you're taxing, whatever your taxable base is. But then we want to distinguish between that and the marginal tax rate. And just like anything else, the marginal tax rate is the change in the total taxes divided by the change in the base. So if I'm looking at, again, it's like marginal anything. If I'm saying, how much do you have to pay on your next $10,000 in income? So you might pay 10% on the first $20,000, and then if you have to pay 20%, 10% on the first $20,000, let's say, and then you pay 20% on the next $20,000, then the marginal tax rate on the last dollar when you move into that next tax bracket is going to be the tax on that additional amount of income. So when you're figuring out, should I work another hour, and we'll talk more about this when we look at the income tax, but I'm saying, should I work another hour, or should I work take on a second job or something like that? you got to look at the decision is going to be on the marginal rate. Okay? Your decisions are made at the margin, just like from Econ 202, right? You do things as long as the marginal benefit's bigger than the marginal cost. And so in this, the decision making is at the margin is where your decisions are made. So it's the marginal tax rate that makes that affects people's behavior. So again, if you know, when we'll look more about this when we look at the income tax, but you'll see that there are different tax brackets, okay? So there's a 10% tax at a certain level of income and a 15% tax at the next level of income and 20%. And so when you're looking at that, you're going to go, okay, what's the tax on the next dollar earned, right? I'm not what my average taxes are, but what's the tax dollar on the next dollar that I earn that affects people's behavior? Now, notice that you can have a constant marginal tax rate, but if you have an exemption, you'll have a tax that is progressive. We haven't forgot to talk about that part yet. All right, so I brought a new eraser to see if it erases better than the other one. I think that does. All right. So a proportional tax has the effect that the average tax rate is constant. So if your average tax rate's 10%, it's 10% if you've made $20,000, and it's 10% if you made $40,000, and 10% if you made $60,000. So the average tax rate, if you have the average tax rate that is constant, then it's a proportional tax. So everybody's paying 30% of their income, right? Or everybody pays 30% of their income in sales tax. That's so as everybody has the same amount of the same proportion of their expenditures on taxable items. Now, a progressive tax if we look at a progressive tax, then what happens with a progressive tax is the average tax rate increases as your income goes up. Increases as income goes up. So it's a progressive tax if, let's say, you are in the $0 to $20,000 income bracket and you pay 10% of your income off in taxes. And I'm in the $40,000 income bracket, and I pay, on average, I've now paid 30% of my income has gone off in taxes. When I figure out what my total taxes are and divide it by my income, so my average tax rate is now higher than your average tax rate. If you look at a regressive tax, then what happens is it goes the other way, right? That the average tax rate increases as your income falls, as your income goes down. So when we talk about a sales tax, one of the things, what's the tax base, right? It's on whatever is going to be taxable under the sales tax. So let's say we had a sales tax that taxed all items, okay? And suppose that low-income people spend a higher percentage of their income on taxable sales, right? Rich people don't spend nearly, I mean, look, how much can Bezos actually spend, right? Out of his billions of dollars, right, could he possibly spend 90% of it? Probably not. Right? But if you were making $10,000 a year, what would happen? You'd probably spend all of your income. So if you look at a tax that oftentimes you might say, well, that's sales tax is a regressive tax. That, when we look into the sales tax, we'll look more at this. But oftentimes that's what you might hear, that a sales tax is a regressive tax. Why is that? Because low-income people spend a higher percentage of their income on taxable items than high-income people do. So if you look at their average tax rate, right? If you look at their taxes divided by the amount of their taxes divided by the amount of their income, okay? What's going to happen? You got the average tax is going up as their income falls. So you hear about taxes being progressive, taxes being regressive, and taxes being proportional. Now, one of the things to notice is that it might be your intuition that if the marginal tax rate were marginal tax rate were constant, that the average tax rate would be constant. And that's almost right, but not quite. And the reason for that is, if you have a constant marginal rate, okay, say 10%. So let's say we have a constant marginal income tax rate. So, and in fact, that's what you have in the state of Michigan, right? In the state of Michigan, you have everybody pays 4.6%. That's on your next dollar, okay? But you have an exemption. There's a certain amount of income that's not taxed. Suppose you have a constant marginal rate, but you don't pay taxes on the first 10,000. Okay? You might think that what you have is a proportional tax, but it isn't. It turns out, if you think about it, that tax is actually a progressive tax. Even if you have a constant marginal tax rate, it still may not be proportional if you have an exemption. So let's just take a Rod Stewart and draw a picture of that. Maybe I'll go ahead and just draw the picture bigger here. Suppose what I have is your taxes in dollars up here, and I've got your income here. And suppose that the way it works is you don't pay anything on the first 10,000. Okay? So no tax, first 10,000, and you pay 10% on all taxes, or excuse me, on all income above that. Okay, so I'm going to pay 10% income tax. So the marginal tax rate's constant. So if I were to draw that, what would happen? It would look like this, right? So for every dollar that you earn, 10% of it would be taxed away, but you don't pay anything if you're less than 10,000. Well, if you have taken enough mathematics, a little geometry or whatever, you'll note that the average is the slope of the line from the origin to the point on the graph, okay? So if I want to, what is the average? It turns out that the average of the taxes over the income, that average is found by taking the slope of that line. So notice that what happens is the average goes up. The average is going up. The slope of that line is getting bigger as income rises. Okay? Once you get way out here, what's going to happen? They're going to look a lot the same, right? if we made this sufficiently small and you went far enough out, right, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the two. So what the point here is that even though Michigan's income tax is a constant rate, 4.6%, I believe. Got to fill out my taxes here pretty soon, sort of. Remember what I think it's still 4.6%. But anyway, the marginal tax rate in Michigan is somewhere between 4 and 5, and that's constant for everybody. But there's an exemption. You don't pay on the first amount of income. So that means that even though you have a constant marginal rate, the tax is still progressive. Now, for another way that you could look at it is if you just did some algebra and you made this line go look like this, right? Brought it down to here. Then if we did a little algebra, what is the equation, right? It's t equals minus a plus by, where y is income and b is this marginal tax rate. If you do that, if you just go ahead and, so if I do the average is what? The average is going to be t over y. It's going to be equal to minus a over y plus b. And what's going to happen here as y goes off, as y goes off to infinity, as y gets larger, this term goes towards 0, right? Because this number's in the denominator, and that number's going to get smaller. So t over y is going to look like b in the end, right? So minus a over y goes off to 0 as y gets big. So just to make the point that you don't want to think that a constant marginal rate is going to be a proportional tax. It turns out it's going to be it's still a progressive tax. We will talk a little bit later on about, has anybody heard of Milton Friedman's negative income tax? Have you heard a little bit about that? Well, what's Friedman's negative income tax? It's basically this. So if we look at, Milton Friedman had this idea of a negative income tax. And what happens is that this, we'll call this A here, okay? So I should have put that earlier, but so A is where this, what happens when income's 0. What happens is you get this amount under Friedman's negative income tax. Everybody gets, let's say, $15,000 to start with. And then what happens is as your income rises, that subsidy or that A is taxed away. So whatever we give you, let's say maybe we give you all $20,000. If we give you $20,000, then it gets taxed away at whatever the marginal tax rate is. And then it has a constant marginal tax rate. Friedman has a constant marginal tax rate in his proposal. So what will happen is it will look like this line. So Friedman's negative income tax with a constant marginal tax rate is still a progressive tax. And maybe we'll talk more about that when we get into the income tax. But in a sense, a negative income tax can be something where it isn't just, hey, let's give the poor more money, right? I mean, it could be something that has also has an economic analysis about it. All right. Next thing to talk about is how we should distribute the taxes. Okay, so we got some definitions here. Okay, we know what an average tax rate, a marginal tax rate, what's a proportional tax, what's a regressive tax. So how should we distribute the taxes? How should the burden, let's say, how should the burden of taxes be distributed? And there's lots of ways that you might think about it. And again, we'll go into each of these in more detail later on. This chapter is sort of an overview. But the first thing to think about is how about the benefit principle that says, okay, those who get more benefit should pay more, right? So if you're getting more benefit from whatever this government good is, or whatever this government service is, then you ought to pay more than I do, okay? And what did we talk about already? We already talked about this in some detail, right? What is Lindahl, right? The Lindahl tax is exactly that, right? What did the Lindahl tax said? What does it say? It says you pay the marginal benefit to you at the point where the sum of the marginal benefits equals the marginal cost, right? That was Lindahl's 1919 paper. And so that clearly fits this idea of a benefit principle, right? The idea was that you give me what your demand for the public good is in the terms of what's your marginal benefits. Then what do? We add up everybody's marginal benefits, go to the marginal cost, and the Lindahl tax, we said, would end up being a unanimous decision, right? Everybody, if you wanted to go beyond that, their marginal benefit would be less than their tax price. And if you went less than that, their marginal benefit's bigger than their tax price. When we did the Lindahl analysis, we found that that would be a result in a unanimity. But notice that what's it based on? It's based on everybody paying their marginal benefit. Now, this is pretty unlikely to happen unless you had a really small small community or a small group where people sort of, knew each other and nobody was trying to cheat and so, let's say we talked about maybe you might have where you had a little neighborhood association or something and you're going to plow the roads and people might say they'd be willing to pay X amount to have towards the road being plowed, et cetera. But of course, what did you just have? You have very high transactions costs if you were to try to do something like that. Another way to look at it is, okay, how about what we do is we actually have user charges. Instead of taxing everybody and trying to tax them on the amount of benefit that they get, here's what we're going to do is, again, we're going to talk more about this later on, but what about garbage pickup? Right? There are goods that the government produce that are realistically private goods. With some positive externality. So that if you pick up your garbage, right, if you get your garbage picked up, it makes the neighborhood look nicer for me, right? But there's definitely, it's excludable, right? And, if I'm using resources to pick up your garbage, I can't be using those same resources to pick up the neighbor's garbage, right? So it's an education is that, maybe another one where you might think about there's some positive externality in children being educated. But they're clearly something that the government can go ahead and charge you for. So if you live in the city of Hillsdale, it turns out that you have to pay Modern Waste Systems, and they come along and they pick up your garbage. Now, the city itself used to do that. Now the city's contracted out with a private company to do that. But if you want electricity, you have the BP, the Hillsdale Board of Public Utilities provides electricity, and you buy it from them. So you could have again user charges, and another thing that we might do, and again we'll talk more about this later, is we might instead of user charges, we might tax a complementary good. So if you think about it, what I might do is I could charge you for the use of the roadway. Okay, I don't know if you ever driven on Interstate 80 or 90, right? You can, there'll be spots where you got to pay. Or what we could do is we could tax you on the use of the complementary good that's used at the same time. Maybe we can't have places where you have to go through and pay your toll, et cetera. It takes too much time, et cetera. So what we'll do is we'll just say, you know what, the amount of road usage that you do is related to the amount of gasoline that you use, okay? Which is, again, when we look at this later on, in the state of Michigan, all the taxes on the motor fuel, it's called the motor fuel tax. What does it do? It goes off and goes into fixing up the roads, okay? Of course, you got problems. What happens if everybody buys a Tesla and it's an electric vehicle, and now they're using the roads, and you're trying to tax this complementary good, which nobody's using anymore? Okay. So again, it's not a matter that you have an exact right answer, but it's just a point that there may be mechanisms to try to have user charges. So the benefit principle would say, okay, we want to tax you based on the benefit that you're getting from the public good. Now, another way that you could look at it is ability to pay. Right? That is, taxes should be based on your ability to pay for the taxes. Right? So, based on your ability to pay for them. Right? That's one reason that we would say, let's have a wealth tax. Okay? Why? Because Jeff Bezos has a higher ability to pay taxes than does that single mom with 3 kids living in Detroit who's working as a waitress at the local restaurant. He's got a much higher ability to pay, and so maybe we ought to. It just seems fair, right? It's like a fairness issue about it's some sort of equity, right? So this is idea of equity or fairness, right? We want to have the tax be equitable. If we had a tax where Jeff Bezos paid the same amount as this single mom that's making $30,000 a year and trying to take care of 2 kids, okay, we would say, hey, that doesn't seem right, right? Maybe she uses the educational services because her kids go to school and Jeff Bezos doesn't, but doesn't seem fair in some sense to have her pay more than he does. Well, that leads us to 2 kinds of equity. That leads us to this idea of horizontal equity. And horizontal equity, you know, we're sort of thinking across, is that if you have the same economic capacity to pay, if you have the same economic capacity to pay, then you pay the same amount. Okay? So that people who have, you know, if you and I have the same economic capacity to pay this stuff, we ought to pay the same amount. That's why it's horizontal equity. That leads us to also think about then, what about vertical equity? Right? What happens if people are different? So we have this concept of horizontal equity, and we have a concept of vertical equity. Those with greater capacity pay more. Right? So horizontal equity just basically says if you and I are in the same position, we ought to pay the same amount in taxes. And vertical equity says if we're in different positions, then we ought to pay different amounts. Now, question then is, like anything else, how do you actually measure it, right? When we were talking about the Lindahl model, we were talking about, okay, how are you actually going to measure everybody's marginal benefits, right? You have a similar thing here. How am I going to measure what your capacity to pay is? Okay? And you might think, well, do you want to make it income or wealth? What if you have, what if you're a farmer, right, and you have 640 acres, and you're growing corn, and you're making $50,000 a year. But if you were to sell the land, you got 640 acres, and maybe they're worth $5,000 an acre. Then you have a lot of wealth. But that wealth, you can't really get at that wealth without selling the land, in which case you wouldn't be a farmer any longer, right? So maybe you have lots of wealth that you can't use, but you have low income. Or are you in the same position as somebody else that has the same amount of wealth, but they have it all in stocks and they're earning the same amount as you, and they have a big amount of IRAs that they can start taking money out? Are those people in the same position? All right, so that's something you got to think about. What about leisure? That is, you and I have the same amount of income. We're both making, let's say we're both making $60,000 a year, but your job only requires you to work 6 months out of the year. And my job requires me to work 12 months out of the year. And I have to work 40 hours a week, and you only have to work 30 hours a week. We have the same amount of income, but you have more leisure than I do. So are we in the same spot, right? That is, could you go out and start earning more income and with your leisure time, and then you'd be in a higher income bracket, and then you'd pay more. So when are people in the same spot? What about health? What happens if I have a medical condition that requires me to spend all sorts of money on healthcare services? And you and I have the same amount of income. We both have $60,000 a year, but I have $25,000 a year in medical expenses that you don't. Okay? So when we start looking at the income tax, for example, if you've ever filled out your income tax, you get a deduction for all your medical expenses that are over 7.5% of your adjusted gross income. And if you've ever filled out your income tax and looked at what's deductible. We have deductions for certain things, right? And one of the reasons you might have deductions for certain things is to try to take account of you and I have the same income, but we have different circumstances which affect our ability to pay. Okay, and so it makes sense from an equity point of view to say, yeah, it seems that it's fair to have people who have more ability to pay more than those who have less ability to pay. But like anything else, how do you go ahead and how do you measure that? And again, it's not a matter of can you get it exactly right, but it gives you an explanation of why you see things, certain deductions, why you get, if you have dependent children, when you fill out your income tax, again, we'll talk more about this later, but when you have dependent children, then you get to deduct a certain amount from your taxable income, et cetera, and those things are there to distinguish between people that are, to try to make it so that we have horizontal and vertical equity, and we're trying to measure what that is. And so if you notice in any discussion, what do you have? You have this discussion of, are the rich paying enough? Just listen to any of the political discussion. Do the rich pay enough? That happens in anything that you're talking about, of any tax plan. Okay, so if you look at, let's say what is the Biden tax plan? When that's being talked about, which is going to be in even more detail here, but if you think about that Biden tax plan, are the rich paying enough, or should we increase the corporate income tax, right? And if we think that, again, we've got an incidence problem, like who actually pays the corporate income tax. But if you think that people who are wealthier tend to benefit from a lower corporate income tax, then are they paying enough, right? And so maybe, and evidently, notice that when in this discussion about whether we ought to raise the corporate income tax isn't a discussion about whether that will increase economic activity, right? If you listen to any of the debate, they're not saying, oh yeah, we should raise the corporate income tax because that will mean that GDP is going to grow by 3% more than it otherwise would have. That's not the discussion. Why are you raising the corporate income tax? Because you don't think the rich are paying enough right now, and the implication must be that the rich tend to benefit more from a corporate income tax. Again, when we've talked about what's the incidence of the tax, it's going to be very difficult in a political situation to discuss the income tax, the incidence of such taxes. It'll be very interesting when you hear the discussion about increasing the corporate income tax. Does anybody on national television say, well, of course, we've looked at the Harburger model, and anybody that's familiar with the Harburger model would understand what happens when you raise the corporate income tax is that you move resources from the corporate sector to the non-corporate sector, and that affects wages and labor in the corporate sector and wages and labor in the non-corporate sector, et cetera, right? You guys will know about that, right? By the time we get done with the class, you guys will be familiar with that. But the average person is rationally ignorant, right? The average person isn't gonna know that. And again, what it would be required there is that the person that is advising the people that are making the decisions, the people in the Congress and the president, advising them on, okay, here's what's going to happen, and here's a way to explain it so the average person can understand it, right? Because even if you know what's the right answer, if your constituency wants the other thing, you're going to probably do that. In fact, when I took a leave from Hillsdale to be Congressman Nick Smith's chief of staff, we had this increase in the minimum wage was before us, and So I was discussing this with the different lobbyists that came in. We're all with the labor unions. And I was saying, well, gee, aren't you really just trying to increase the price of a substitute for high-skilled labor, right? You know, because none of your members actually make the minimum wage, right? They all make well above what the proposed increase in the minimum wage is going to be. So you're just trying to increase the price of a substitute. That caused some consternation with the lobbyists. When I was talking to the senator from Michigan at the time, he said that he understood that an increase in the minimum wage was actually going to cause unemployment among the low-income folks, but his constituency wanted it anyway, so he was voting for it. Nick ended voting against it, but in the end, it passed anyway. Again, why do I give you essay questions, right? I give you essay questions because I want you to be able to explain it to somebody. I don't want you to just recognize the right answer. So, that's why I've put the old exams on the, in the Wolfram folder. Okay, you're not going to be surprised at what the questions are that I'm going to ask you. So, what does that mean? It means that you have to be able to explain it in a clear, concise fashion. And that's sort of what the purpose of this is. Again, the incidence of the tax is going to turn out to be very important, and we very seldom see a true discussion of that. But it's something that you need to know. All right. I think we'll go ahead and stop here. What we'll do for Wednesday is we will be working our way through Chapter 10. We'll probably finish Chapter 10 probably on Friday, and that's what we'll cover for the midterm. And then, if we get through fast enough, we seem to be going a little bit faster because everybody's got masks on and nobody's asking questions. So we seem to be moving faster than normal. We'll start Chapter 11. So if you're sort of thinking ahead, we'll do Chapter 11, but that won't be on the midterm. All right, and don't forget we set up the review session. I wrote that down, 6 to 7:30. I think that was it. Yeah.